Hi guys, welcome back to another speed talking review for AP Psychology. This one will be based on learning. And remember, learning is going to be a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to changes in the environment. So with this one, we'll talk about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. But ultimately, this is all about the behaviorists. We will be talking about associative learning. And whether we're talking about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, or observational learning, we're talking about learning through associations. In classical conditioning, the association is between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, causing a response. You eventually learn that these two things get paired together consistently and they will yield the same response. In operant conditioning is between a behavior and a response or a consequence. So the behavior and it's either reinforced or the behavior and it's punished, but there is a consequence to the behavior. And then when we look at something like observational learning, it's when you make the association between another person's behavior and your ability to reproduce the same behavior. Let's start with classical conditioning. As soon as you see classical, go all the way back to the very beginning. The most classic behaviors that we have is going to be Pavlov. So with Pavlov, we are going right back to the entire idea of the dog salivating to a bell. Now, a lot of you have pets and your dogs don't salivate to bells at home, so you know that there has to be something mixed in with this. If it helps, go back to the experiment that you guys watched in class where I showed you a previous student who classically conditioned his dog to fear water. Any of those things should work. But honestly, I think the easiest one is kids who are afraid of thunder and lightning. So when we're talking about this, the unconditioned stimulus is going to be the thing that yields an unconditioned response. It's going to actually evoke it. You don't have to learn these because there's a reflex in there. So are you afraid of light or are you afraid of a loud boom? And so it's the thunder that you're afraid of. So thunder causes a child to cover their ears. Thunder causes a startle or a fear response. Pair that up with a flash of light in the sky. So the flash of light signals that a boom is coming. And eventually you have the child make the association flashlight, boom, fear. Flashlight, boom, fear. Cut out the entire need for the boom. Flashlight, they cover their ears and they're afraid. The response is always the same. Here's where the unconditioned and conditioned part comes in. The unconditioned response is in response to the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is in response to what has become associated with the unconditioned stimulus, which is now the conditioned stimulus. So the child now will hold their ears to a flash of light or lightning in the sky. That's the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. The child that covers their ears to the booming thunder is showing you their reflexive unconditioned response to the unconditioned stimulus of thunder. We talk about this as an acquisition. So the acquisition phase is during or the period in which you pair these two stimuli together, the unconditioned stimulus and what we would at that point call a neutral stimulus, a stimulus that hasn't gained any learned power yet. If you want to extinguish this behavior, and you can extinguish a classically conditioned behavior, you can extinguish an operant conditioning behavior, all of these things can be extinguished. Extinction literally is the removal of the behavior or the dying off of the behavior. In this case, extinction happens when lightning and thunder are no longer paired together. So if you're trying to get a child to no longer fear thunder or lightning, technically, show them, video streaming of a thunderstorm, but keep the audio off. They're going to repeatedly get the light flash without the sound, and eventually they're going to see that the light flash is not what they're afraid of. Reacquisition. So with reacquisition, you reacquire the learning. We usually talked about this as spontaneous recovery. So after a period where the behavior has been extinguished, will it pop back up again without any new conditioning added in? So behavior is extinguished and all of a sudden the kid sees a thunder cloud rolling in and there's a flash of lightning and he covers his ears. After you thought you had extinguished the behavior, he had spontaneous recovery. Sometimes spontaneous recovery can happen just because you put the person back in the original context in which the event happened. Stimulus discrimination and generalization. The child might discriminate. Flashes in the sky might be the thing that causes them to cover their ear, but flickering of lights in the house does not. Generalization. flashing in the sky may cause it, and the flicking on and off of a flashlight might cause it. You don't know. But literally the idea is that if you discriminate, it's your ability to determine that one thing will cause the response and something very similar to it will not, versus generalization. Something will cause a response and something very similar to it will also cause a response. An easier one for generalization: you have a kid who is well, let's switch it. A dog who's going to salivate at a bell, and then he also salivates at a chime. If they're close enough together, the dog has the exact same generalized behavior. You should know second order and higher order conditioning. This is that kind of linked in conditioning. So you have the neutral stimulus paired with the unconditioned stimulus yielding the response. That neutral stimulus becomes conditioned, and then you're adding in another neutral stimulus that now gets associated with what has been conditioned, and the conditioned stimulus actually acts almost like an unconditioned stimulus, even though it does not reflexively evoke the response. So an example for this one would be something like police cars. The unconditioned stimulus might be getting yelled at by your parents when you drove too fast, and it causes the unconditioned response of your heart rate flying. And every time that your parents yelled at you, it was when they mentioned the word police or police car, or they just happened to drive past something like that. And so the concept of police causes your heart rate to elevate, and then you pair the concept of police with a police car. You've never been pulled over before. You shouldn't have this response. Now the concept of police plus the visual of the police car has your heart rate spiking. And originally it was the fear of getting in trouble with your parents. We had a couple other examples in class. Something like I think it was the holidays, and it was like somebody had a fear of snow, then snow got tied into Santa Claus. And Santa Claus got tied into, I don't know, trees. But literally, it's the idea that it's kind of linking in an additional neutral stimulus. It's a second neutral stimulus that becomes conditioned. Biological preparedness. We are more likely to be easily conditioned to those things that would have allowed us to survive back in ancestral times. So, go dial it back about 12, 13,000 years. Chances are being afraid of a snake was probably going to be really good for you, because being afraid of a snake would be more likely to allow you to live. Being afraid of high places, being afraid of lightning, those things would actually have benefited you if you had a healthy fear of them. And so today we may have a greater chance of being afraid of things that would have allowed us to survive a very long time ago. Garcia and Cooling study, we're going to talk about taste aversion. There's a couple things that you want to know about this. One, you don't need repeated pairings to have been classically conditioned. And in this one, they did it with rats. They gave them a little bit of radiation poisoning while they were eating, and then eventually the food that caused them to throw up, and technically it was the radiation, they no longer wanted to have anything to do with it. One exposure, one really bad aversion to something might be sufficient. You guys had the reading about the wolves and the mutton that was laced with a nausea chemical. The wolves ate the mutton made them vomit. Technically the chemical did, and then they avoided the sheep that they associated with the mutton. Same kind of idea. One strong pairing might be all that it takes. And the other point to this one, the other point that's really important, is that no one vomits the minute the food touches their mouth. This is going to be a kind of almost like a time delay. It's hours later that you get sick, but you tie it back into that behavior. Systematic desensitization. We'll talk about this one when we get to therapy again, but again, we're going to speed through a lot of this stuff this week and next. So systematic desensitization. You are going to systematically, step by step, procedurally desensitize someone to something. So for this case, you have someone that's afraid of spiders. You're not going to just put them in a room filled with spiders and tell them to get over it. That's called flooding, and it can be a little dangerous. What you want to do is you want to sit there and you want to go, all right, first we're going to just have you mentally visualize spiders until you can calmly do that. And then we're going to have you look at a picture of a spider until you can bring your heart rate down and calmly do it. Remember, these people are probably phobics, and that means they're going to have a high anxiety response. And after you've been able to look at a picture of it, maybe we give you a toy spider and we just want you in the same room as it, then you hold it, and notice how this is very systematic. Gradually increasing the stimulus, while at the same time systematically asking them every single time to bring their heart rate level down to deal with the anxiety until eventually they can be around an actual spider and it doesn't cause them to go into a panic. It does not mean that they like them. It doesn't mean that they might ever like them, but they're able to function. Okay, now it's time for you guys to switch gears. We're done talking about classical conditioning and now we're into operant conditioning. First name that should pop into your head is Skinner. So Skinner, think of the Skinner box, think of rats, think of pigeons, think of reinforcements, think of schedules of reinforcement, think of punishment, think Skinner. Law of effect. Obviously this is not Skinner. The law of effect was written by Edward Thorndike. Thorndike's law of effect basically stated that behaviors that are followed by positive responses are more likely to continue, and behaviors that are followed by negative outcomes or responses are less likely to continue. Again, you are going to do whatever behavior based on the effect of it. All right, so reinforcement, positive versus negative. Do not let me catch you using negative reinforcement as a synonym for punishment. Don't. It's bad. So positive reinforcement, anything that increases a behavior. So the behavior increases. Positive, the behavior increases because the person is getting something they want, something rewarding, something desirable. Negative reinforcement, the behavior is increasing because they get to avoid something they don't want, something that might be negative, something that is undesirable. Positive reinforcement, you clean your room, you get $5. Going to clean your room again. Negative reinforcement. Every time you walk in the door and your room's dirty, your mom starts to bother you about it. To avoid your mom talking to you about how dirty your room is, you go up and immediately clean it. She will learn that, one, her nagging has worked, but you will learn to avoid it by doing what you are supposed to do. You'll increase the cleaning behavior to avoid the thing you don't want, which is to get yelled at by your parents. Primary reinforcers are going to be innately reinforcing. In other words, it's going to be something that has a biological purpose. It's going to be food, it's going to be water, it's going to be shelter, it's going to be warmth. It is going to be something that you didn't learn to value. Secondary reinforcer, you had to learn to value it. So a secondary reinforcer could be something like applause, money, any kind of token economy where it's a gold star or a sticker for a behavior. You have to learn to value those things. When we're talking about getting people to modify behavior, because that's what this is about, you might use something called shaping. And again, shaping requires what we use this term as successive approximations. So it's not the exact behavior, but it's getting closer and closer to the desired behavior. So remember how Josh in class kind of did the big chicken dance and never really quite got to what we wanted him to do? Okay. We were waiting for this absolute perfect behavior, but you don't get that. So you start with really small behaviors, like someone kind of turning the right way, and you reward that behavior, and then sitting the right way, or picking up the marker, or whatever it might be. But you literally take it, and behavior by behavior, the closer they get, you continue to reward those closer and closer behaviors. Chaining is another type of shaping. This requires complex behaviors broken down into their individual parts. You shape each individual parts and then you link the chain to back together. So think of something like biking or even swimming. Biking, you have to pedal, you have to steer, and you have to balance. So you may practice those three things independently, and as you get better at each one of them and you get rewarded for each one of them, the final product, you take these three different behaviors and you link them back together into a single behavior. So chaining is a type of shaping. There are 5 schedules of reinforcement, the first one being continuous. The great thing about continuous reinforcement, every time the behavior emerges, you get a reinforcer for it. It allows for very speedy acquisition of a behavior. The negative part of this, when you finally take away the reinforcer, you may also very quickly see an extinction in the behavior. Now, what you will see is the reinforcer doesn't come, so the behavior may become more pronounced or even more extreme. And then when the reinforcer doesn't come again, then they're like, forget it, I'm done. I didn't get it when I did it more, so they'll walk away from it, and pretty much the behavior becomes extinguished immediately. So that's why we have partial schedules. So the first one is continuous, then we have our 4 partial. If you see the word ratio, it is the number of behaviors. If you see the word interval, it is a time frame. So a fixed ratio, every 5 behaviors or every 10 behaviors. At number 5, you get rewarded. Variable ratio. You don't know how many times you have to do a behavior to get rewarded. The great thing about variable schedules, whether it's interval or a ratio, because they are unpredictable, they're very hard to extinguish. Fixed interval, Every 2 weeks, you get a paycheck. Every 4.5 weeks, you get a report card grade. A variable interval. You don't know at what time the behavior will get checked. So it's not the number of times you do the behavior, you just don't know at what time you'll get checked, which causes you to have pretty steady behavior. Aversion conditioning, we talked about escape versus avoidance. When we talk about escape learning, remember, to escape something, you have to experience it and then learn to get away from it. So escape learning, you were looking at an animal that was going to be in Skinner's shuttle box. And the shuttle box looked like a Skinner box, but it had a small window. There was a safe side and an electrocution side. The animal would feel a small amount of an electric shock, and it would learn to escape into the safe compartment. Now remember, the first time that the animal experiences the shock, they're going to search rapidly in that kind of compartment to find the open window to get through. The second time they experience the shock, they're going to again search for that window, but they'll probably get out quicker. Going on third, 4, 5 times, they're going to do the behavior much faster each time. They're going to learn to escape the negative stimulus and get into that safe place. It's actually reinforced by negative reinforcement. To avoid the shock, they move to the safe area. They do this quicker over time. Avoidance learning, strangely enough, actually marries escape learning and operant conditioning with classical conditioning. So in this case, to avoid the shock, they learn to associate a signal and they escape when the signal is present. In this case, a light would flash. The light would flash before the electric shock. The animal would see the light, get the electric shock, not like the shock, move into the other compartment. Eventually, it would learn to associate the light, which has no power, with the electrical shock, which causes them pain, which causes them to leave. And eventually, the light would tell them you should just you should just avoid the shock altogether and escape into the next compartment. So the light then signals that they should move. Learned helplessness. When an animal or a person cannot avoid a negative condition, they may become helpless. They may actually give up their own ability to advocate for themselves, defend themselves, protect themselves. And it's a term called learned helplessness. So the first couple of times the animal is going to fight back, but if they realize that despite however hard they fight back or whatever they do, they're going to be held in the same exact environment, nothing will change for them, then they may give up any sense of trying. And you can almost let the animal free and they will still have learned just to give up. Punishment. Understand that punishment helps decrease the behavior. Now, when we talk about punishment, you actually have to remember that punishment can be used correctly if used in concert with reinforcement. That exclusive punishment does not modify the behavior, but it often teaches behavior avoidance, or at least avoidance of the teacher. And that's another thing that I didn't mention earlier on. With operant conditioning, it is not the teacher that determines whether the behavior has been reinforced or punished, it's the learner. And I always use that example. Take a shy student in class, ask them if they'll, you can read their essay, and then you read the essay or have them read the essay to the entire class. They may actually stop writing well, so they don't get the attention. You may have punished them. You get a boisterous student who loves to be the center of attention and you ask them to read their essay in class, they may love it. And so they may even try harder to write well so they can be the center of attention. That's going to be a reinforcement. Okay, omission training. Sometimes the best way to get rid of a behavior is to just ignore it. And that's essentially what omission training is, to give a non-response. So, especially with little kids, when they learn a bad word, it's really funny and you want to laugh, but you also don't want to yell at them because they might think that that's a way to get attention. So essentially, to do nothing. So you have a little kid, they say their first bad word, don't laugh, don't yell at them, just pretend you didn't hear it. If they say it 17 times and you still give them no response, eventually they're just going to feel like it's not worth doing anything. They don't get a good response or a bad response, they get no response. They may actually discontinue the behavior. We've talked about the overjustification effect, but just a little bit of a review on this one. Overjustification effect. If you reward someone for a behavior that they already like to do, they may no longer do it because of the internal motivation. They may now only do it for the reward that comes with it. Good example of this, you have a kid who's great at art, you start entering them into art contests, eventually they stop doing art just because they love to draw. They only produce art when they're going to get rewarded for it. And one thing that we haven't talked about, and it every once in a while really kind of just subtly pops up, but not that often, you should know the Premack principle, and I have it spelled out here for you guys. Rewards are relative. You will perform a less desirable behavior in anticipation of a more desired reward. That kind of feels like common sense. You may do something you don't want to do if there is a big payoff for it, but if there's something you don't want to do and the payoff is very little, you couldn't get someone to do that behavior. So the size of the reward matters. And one other thing that we had talked about before, the timing of the reward matters. If it is too long of a delay and too small of a reward, you will not get the desired behavior. Other things that you guys should know. Go back and remember Tolman. So Tolman had latent learning in the cognitive maps. This was the entire scenario with the 3 different groups of mice. First group of mice allowed to wander through the maze. They were the control group. Second group of mice, they were rewarded the minute they got out of the maze. You saw that they started to decrease the time, but they never really got too efficient at it. Third group of mice were allowed to wander for 10 days. On day 11, they got rewarded. And on day 12, they showed almost immediate and the quickest time out of the maze because they had unintentionally learned the entire layout of the maze. So what they had done is they latently, unintentionally learned the entire map, and they built a cognitive map. They relied on a mental map of that layout. And I always tell you guys, strangely enough, we build cognitive maps of things like grocery stores and places that we shop. We don't mean to study it. We don't mean to remember where things are, but because we walk around them often aimlessly, we learn them. Social or observational learning. So social learning theory is the same as observational learning theory, and this was brought to you by Albert Bandura. And this is the idea that models will express a behavior, and if you watch them, you desire it, you can replicate it, you remember it, and you want to produce the behavior, you may find that someone will do it. And this is done with the Bobo doll experiment. So you had the Bobo doll, you had an adult that got aggressive, the adult was frustrated, beat up the Bobo doll. They took children, they gave them a sense of frustration, left them in a room with a whole bunch of things that they could have used. They attacked the Bobo doll as well, but not only did they attack it, they attacked it in the exact same way that the model did. So this was monkey see, monkey do. They used the same novel language, used the same abuse. Vicarious learning, if you were to reward the model or were to punish the model, it would impact the person observing them. So they themselves were not rewarded or punished, but they were able to observe someone being rewarded or punished, and that's learning vicariously. So in the Bobo doll experiment, the adult got spanked and the children completely avoided the Bobo doll. In the reinforcement, they got praise or a cookie for beating up the Bobo doll, and the children were even more aggressive than they would have been. The other thing that we get from observational learning is that mirror neurons fire during this. So watching someone do it, your brain actually takes on the sensation that it is doing it itself. This helps build things like procedural memory. It also is a great foundation for our ability to empathize. So important people that you should know from memory: Pavlov, classical conditioning, Pavlov's dog experiment; Watson and Rayner did the baby Albert experiment. Remember, baby Albert was that great situation where we learned about generalization. He was not only scared of the little white rat, but he was scared of the little white sealskin coat. And again, sad story about Albert. He died prior to us ever finding out whether or not he had a permanent phobia of little white mice. Thorndike, law of effect; Skinner, operant conditioning. Wolfgang Kohler is going to be rat experiment, taste aversion. And Bandura is going to be our observational learning that we just spoke about, in Tolman, again, cognitive maps and latent learning. That should be everything for the learning unit. I guarantee you guys there will be plenty of information. Do not bypass Pavlov. Make sure you know that. Make sure you are good and solid on Skinner. Bandura should feel pretty easy for you guys, I hope. Again, if you have any questions, please come see me.